Somewhere in the last 100 years or so, economics just changed. It completely transformed. It stopped sounding like a conversation about, well, us, about people, and it started sounding a whole lot more like physics. In this explainer, we're going to dig into the story of exactly how that happened, all driven by the vision of one incredibly influential guy.
And this slide, it just nails the shift, right? Back then, economics was all about stories. Thinkers talked about bakers and butchers, about human ambition, about gut feelings like fear and panic. Today, it's a language of equations, graphs, and this cold, clean logic of optimization and equilibrium. Now, this wasn't some slow, gradual drift. Oh no, this was a deliberate, full-scale reinvention.
Okay, so to really get this, we have to rewind a bit. Before this huge change, economics was, it was tied at the hip with philosophy. It was all about the messy reality of human life. It wasn't even trying to be a hard science. Yeah, economists like Adam Smith or even much later John Maynard Keynes, they were wrestling with big, complicated stuff. Moral judgments, status games, and what Keynes famously called animal spirits. Those wild, unpredictable urges and emotions that actually drive our decisions. The whole field was argumentative because, well, life is argumentative. But then a crisis hit. A crisis so big that this old way of thinking just couldn't explain it, let alone fix it. The Great Depression didn't just break economies, it completely shattered the intellectual confidence of economics itself. And that left this huge vacuum. And look, the failure was just massive. Classical theory had always promised that markets would just fix themselves, that the system was fundamentally stable. But when you're faced with millions of people unemployed and banks collapsing left and right, those ideas just ring hollow. The old framework had absolutely no credible answers. So, John Maynard Keynes, he offered a way out. He basically said, hey, markets can stay irrational way longer than you think, and governments have to step in and manage demand. His ideas were brilliant, they were practical, they worked politically, but they were still intuitive, they were philosophical. And in the post-World War II era, the world was hungry for something that felt more solid, more scientific. And this is where our protagonist enters the scene, Paul Samuelson. He wasn't some revolutionary trying to burn it all down. No, he was a system builder, a young prodigy who looked at economics and thought, we can do better. We can give this field the authority and the credibility of a hard science, just like physics. This was the question that drove him. He saw a discipline that, in his mind, talked way too much and proved way too little. So in his incredible 1947 book, Foundations of Economic Analysis, he set out to build this unified mathematical framework that could explain the entire economy with the elegance and the absolute rigor of physics. So what was his big idea? How did he pull it off? How did he create this single unified story for all of economics? Well, it all boiled down to one incredibly powerful, simplifying idea, the logic of optimization. Samuelson's core idea was almost deceptively simple. Just assume a few things. 1, consumers are always trying to maximize their satisfaction, or utility. 2, firms are always trying to maximize their profit. And 3, markets are the mechanism that coordinates all these decisions, pushing the whole system toward a stable balance, or equilibrium. Now, the genius here wasn't saying that people are perfectly rational calculators. It was realizing that if you assume they act that way, your models become clean, powerful, and predictive. And maybe his biggest trick, his most important contribution, was something called the neoclassical synthesis. This was his genius move to bridge the gap between those old classical ideas about free markets and the newer Keynesian ones about government intervention. It was a compromise that would go on to dominate the field and shape economic policy for decades. It was really this grand bargain. On one side, you keep the classical belief that, yeah, markets are generally efficient. But on the other, you legitimize the Keynesian idea that governments absolutely should step in when those markets go haywire. It was perfect. It satisfied almost everyone, and it gave economics this one unified story to tell. It became the bedrock of the post-war world. And Samuelson didn't just hide this stuff in academic papers. He wrote a textbook simply called Economics. And it became the most influential textbook of all time. For generations of students, this book was economics. His framework wasn't just a theory anymore. It was the default setting. Any other way of thinking about the economy started to seem, well, a little unprofessional. But, and there's always a but, this newfound mathematical confidence had consequences. The very tools that gave economics all this authority also created a new kind of distance from reality. a world where complex models could become shields for really difficult decisions. So you have these trade-offs, and they were huge. On one hand, what was gained? Precision, legitimacy as a science, and a ton of influence over policy. But what was lost? Well, the focus on human psychology, the role of power, and just the general, unpredictable messiness of real life. All that stuff was suddenly treated like static, like noise you could filter out, not an essential part of the system itself. And this led to something really crucial. This new language let policymakers frame their choices not as political or ideological, but as just technical necessities. The answer to a really hard question wasn't a moral judgment anymore. It was simply what the model says. And that creates this powerful shield from public debate and accountability. But this intense focus on equilibrium, on everything finding a nice, stable balance, it created this massive blind spot. The framework was amazing at describing the economy during calm periods, but it really struggled to account for the things that are emotional, chaotic, and nonlinear. Things like market bubbles, sudden crashes, widespread panic. These weren't seen as core features of capitalism, just weird anomalies. And then, in 2008, this blind spot was exposed in the most brutal way imaginable. Incredibly sophisticated models, all built on Samuelson's foundations, predicted a tiny, tiny amount of risk in the financial system. The actual outcome? A catastrophic global failure. The problem wasn't a lack of smart people. It was an overconfidence in a very narrow way of seeing the world.
So, how do we make sense of this? What's Samuelson's legacy, really? Well, the best way I know to think about it is through this simple but really powerful metaphor: the difference between the map and the territory.
Look, the answer here is not to just throw away all the math and go back to telling folksy stories. That's not it at all. The models are incredibly useful tools. The whole key is to always remember that they are simplifications. They are not reality itself. That's it. That's the whole idea. Samuelson gave economics an incredibly detailed, useful map. But no map, no matter how good, can ever capture every single tree, every rock, every river of the actual landscape. The trouble starts when we forget that, and we start treating the map as the territory.
And that brings us to the ultimate lesson. The problem wasn't that the math was wrong. The problem was that the whole discipline became a little too confident, a little too certain of its own abstractions. The greatest danger is when we start to believe that our beautiful models have somehow tamed the fundamental, messy uncertainty of the real world.
Which leaves us with one last question to think about. Paul Samuelson gave economics a powerful, authoritative voice, a voice that speaks with confidence for central banks and governments. But in gaining that authority, who did it stop speaking to? It's a tension that defines so much of our world today, and understanding where it came from, well, that's the first step to figuring out where we go from here.